The Ashes of the Sodder Children. The Appalachian Mountains in late December hold a very specific kind of cold. It is a damp, biting chill that seeps through the wooden floorboards of old houses and settles deep into the marrow of the people who live there. In the small, quiet town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, the night of Christmas Eve in the year 1945 was meant to be one of warmth and chaotic joy. The Sodder family home, a large two-story timber house situated on a quiet stretch of road, was overflowing with life. George and Jenny Sodder, Italian immigrants who had built a comfortable life and a respectable hauling business, were raising 9 of their 10 children under that roof, their eldest son away serving in the military. It was a house full of noise, laughter, and the bright, frantic anticipation of Christmas morning. But the dense woods surrounding the property were silent, hiding secrets in the deep shadows that stretched toward the porch. To understand the nightmare that consumed the Sodder family, one must first look at the shadows that had been gathering around them in the months prior. George Sodder was a man of strong convictions. He was openly opposed to the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, a stance that had earned him quiet enemies within the local immigrant community. The animosity was not just whispered, it had materialized on his doorstep. Earlier that fall, a visiting life insurance salesman, enraged by George's political arguments, had pointed a trembling finger at the house and sworn that it would go up in smoke and that George's children would be destroyed. A few weeks later, a drifter looking for work had wandered onto the property, staring intently at the fuse boxes on the side of the house. The man had casually remarked that the wiring would cause a fire someday, a strange comment considering George had recently had the entire electrical system inspected and deemed perfectly safe by the local power company. These were easily dismissed as empty threats or the rambling of strangers. But in the desolate quiet of a winter night, isolated in the mountains, threats have a way of taking root. The evening of December 24th began with the mundane comforts of the holidays. 5 of the younger children, 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty begged their mother to stay up past their bedtime to play with the new toys they had opened early. Jenny agreed, under the condition that they remember to feed the cows and close the chicken coops before they finally went to sleep. She took her youngest baby upstairs, leaving the 5 children in the warm glow of the living room, while 2 older boys had already gone up to their attic bedroom to sleep. The house was peaceful, the wood stove crackled, but the peace was an illusion. At exactly 12:30 a.m., the sharp, mechanical shrill of the telephone shattered the silence. In a house that large, the sudden ringing in the dead of night was jarring. Jenny pulled herself out of bed and walked downstairs into the dark hallway to answer it. When she lifted the heavy receiver to her ear, she was greeted by an unfamiliar woman's voice asking for a name Jenny did not recognize. But it was not the mistake that unsettled her, it was the ambient noise bleeding through the earpiece. Behind the woman's voice, Jenny could hear the distinct clinking of crystal glasses and the sound of raucous, unsettling laughter. It was a hollow, eerie sound that seemed to lack any genuine mirth. Jenny told the woman she had the wrong number. The woman offered a strange, chilling chuckle before the line clicked dead. As Jenny turned away from the phone, a creeping sense of unease washed over her. She noticed that the lights downstairs were still burning brightly, the curtains were wide open to the blackness outside, and the heavy wooden front door was completely unlocked. Her daughter Marion had fallen asleep on the living room sofa, but the other 5 children who had begged to stay up were nowhere to be seen. Assuming they had simply forgotten their chores and quietly crept upstairs to their beds in the attic, Jenny locked the door, turned out the lights, and returned to her room, trying to shake the lingering echo of that phantom laughter. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the silence of the house was broken again. This time, it was a physical impact. Jenny was startled awake by the distinct, heavy thud of an object striking the roof of the house right above her head. It was followed by a strange rolling noise, like a hard ball of heavy rubber skipping down the slanted shingles. She held her breath in the dark, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself back to sleep. 30 minutes later, at 1:30 a.m., the true horror began. Jenny woke again, coughing. The air in the bedroom was thick and sharp with the acrid scent of burning wood and melting rubber. She threw open her bedroom door and was met with a wall of suffocating black smoke billowing up from the first floor. The fire was roaring violently near the office, right by the fuse boxes and the telephone line. Panic, pure and primal, took over. She screamed for George. They grabbed the baby, while Marion and the two older boys from the attic stumbled through the smoke to join them. They burst through the front doors into the freezing December air, gasping for breath, expecting the rest of the children to be right behind them. They stood barefoot in the snow, the biting wind whipping around them, and turned back to the house. The glow of the flames was growing brighter, casting long, dancing shadows into the woods. But Maurice, Martha, Louis, little Jenny, and Betty were not outside. George, adrenaline flooding his veins, rushed back toward the burning house. He shattered a window, cutting his arm to the bone, but the entire downstairs staircase was a roaring wall of fire. He could not get up to the attic. He screamed their names into the inferno, but the only response was the deafening crackle of burning timber. This is the moment the incident twisted from a tragic accident into a labyrinth of psychological terror. George realized he could climb to the attic windows from the outside. He ran to the side of the house to grab the heavy wooden ladder that had leaned against the same wall for years. It was gone. He frantically searched the dark yard, blood dripping from his arm into the snow. The ladder had vanished. It would not be found until hours later, discarded in a steep ditch nearly 75 feet away from the house. Desperate, George ran to the heavy coal trucks parked in the driveway. He planned to drive one directly against the house and climb onto the cab to reach his trapped children. He threw open the door of the first truck, cranked the ignition, and pressed the gas. The engine whined, but refused to turn over. He sprinted to the second truck, sliding behind the wheel, turning the key. Dead. Both massive engines, which had run perfectly the afternoon before, were completely immobilized. As the fire raged on, someone realized the rain barrels used for extinguishing small fires were frozen solid. A daughter ran through the dark to a neighbor's house to call the fire department, but the operator did not answer. It was later discovered that the solder's own telephone line had not been burned by the fire, it had been intentionally severed at the very top of the pole. George and Jenny were forced to stand in the snow and watch their home burn. They watched the flames consume the second floor. They listened with agonizing dread for the screams of their 5 children. But there were no screams, there was no sound of panic from the attic windows, just the roaring fire and the silent, impenetrable wall of the Appalachian woods staring back at them. By the time the sun rose on Christmas morning, the massive house was nothing more than a shallow, smoking basement of gray ash and glowing embers. The local fire chief, delayed by a severe lack of manpower, did not arrive until 8 o'clock in the morning. When the embers finally cooled enough to be searched, the police and fire crews began sifting through the rubble. They were looking for 5 small bodies. They found melted household appliances. They found fragments of a tin roof. They found the twisted metal of the wood stove, but they did not find a single human bone. It is a scientific impossibility for a typical wood-framed house fire to completely vaporize human skeletons. A house fire burns at roughly 1200 degrees Fahrenheit for an hour or two. A professional crematorium must burn at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit for multiple hours, and even then, large fragments of bone remain behind to be manually ground into ash. The idea that 5 distinct human skeletons were reduced to absolutely nothing but gray dust in a brief residential fire defies the laws of physics. The searchers sifted the dirt, they dragged rakes through the soot. There was no flesh, no skulls, no teeth, nothing. This missing evidence birthed a psychological horror far worse than grief: eternal uncertainty. If the children did not die in the fire, where did they go? The realization crept into George and Jenny's minds like a slow-acting poison. the cut telephone wire, the missing ladder dragged into the dark, the engines of the trucks expertly disabled in the dead of winter, the strange woman laughing on the phone just an hour before the flames broke out. The fire was not a malfunction, it was a calculated distraction. As the years bled into decades, the surviving Sodders rebuilt their lives in the shadow of that empty, ash-filled crater. They erected a massive billboard on Route 16, displaying the faces of their 5 missing children, begging for answers that would never come. The true horror of that Christmas Eve was not just the fire, but the absolute chilling certainty that they were not alone in the dark that night. Someone had been watching. Someone had crept onto their property, disabled their lifelines, and ignited their home. And while George and Jenny screamed into the inferno, someone was likely standing deep in the freezing tree line, watching the parents suffer, while 5 children were swallowed whole by the Appalachian night, never to be seen again. The disturbance at Larrabee Street. The municipality of Horicon, Wisconsin is situated in Dodge County, widely known for the Horicon Marsh, a massive peat bog and national wildlife refuge that dominates the local geography. In the late 1980s, the town represented a quintessential image of the American Midwest, industrial, working class, and socially tight-knit. It was a community where privacy was respected, but where the routines of neighbors were generally understood and observed. In 1987, a specific residence on Larrabee Street became the center of a prolonged series of domestic disturbances that would eventually involve law enforcement, clergy, and the wider community. The events documented within the home of the Tallman family remain one of the most clinically detailed accounts of a purported haunting in the region's history, distinguished by the involvement of the local police chief and the eventual physical displacement of the residents. The residence in question was a modest 2-story structure typical of the architectural style favored in the area during the mid-20th century. Alan and Debbie Tallman, a young couple with 3 children, had purchased the home and lived there without incident for approximately 1 year prior to the onset of the disturbances. The environment was described by neighbors and friends as stable. Alan Tallman was employed at a local factory and was regarded as a pragmatic, hard-working individual with no prior history of interest in the occult or paranormal phenomena. The family's life was dictated by the rhythms of work, school, and childcare, with no indications of domestic strife or psychological instability that might later be used to explain the events that followed. The transformation of the home from a place of sanctuary to a site of fear began not with a structural change to the house itself, but with the introduction of a specific piece of furniture in the winter of 1987. Needing additional sleeping arrangements for their growing children, the Tallmans visited a second-hand furniture shop in the nearby vicinity. They purchased a bunk bed, described as a sturdy, wooden set with a distinct aesthetic that appeared to be several decades old. The history of the object was unknown at the time of purchase, and the shop owner provided no provenance regarding its previous owners. The transaction was routine. The bed was transported to the Larrabee Street residence, assembled, and placed in one of the upstairs bedrooms. This mundane acquisition marks the chronological beginning of the recorded anomalies. Almost immediately after the bed was brought into the house, the atmosphere within the residence reportedly shifted, though the initial manifestations were subtle enough to be dismissed as coincidence or environmental quirks. The first phase of the disturbance was characterized by a rapid decline in the physical health of the family members. Within days of the furniture's arrival, the Tallman children began to suffer from inexplicable respiratory ailments and high fevers. These illnesses were cyclical, intensifying at night and abating during the day when the children were removed from the house. Medical intervention was sought, but physicians were unable to identify a specific viral or bacterial cause that satisfied the duration and severity of the symptoms. While the parents initially attributed this to the typical spread of winter viruses, the correlation between the severity of the symptoms and the children's proximity to the newly furnished room would later be cited by investigators as a significant data point. The parents, too, reported feelings of lethargy and an unshakable sense of being observed, a psychological pressure that seemed to emanate from the upper level of the home. Following the onset of these physical symptoms, the phenomena escalated to audible and kinetic disturbances. The family reported hearing the distinct sound of footsteps pacing the hallways on the second floor when all family members were accounted for on the ground level. These sounds were described as heavy and deliberate, often pausing outside the master bedroom or the children's room. On several occasions, the family dog, a typically docile animal, exhibited signs of extreme aggression or terror, barking continuously at empty corners of the room or refusing to enter the upstairs hallway entirely. The auditory phenomena soon grew to include the sound of doors opening and closing with force. Alan Tallman, attempting to find a rational explanation, inspected the home for drafts, loose hinges, or structural settling. He reportedly secured windows and placed draft stoppers at the base of doors, yet the banging sounds persisted, occurring with a rhythm that defied the erratic nature of wind or thermal expansion. The situation transitioned from environmental annoyance to overt intimidation when the family began to experience equipment malfunctions that seemed directed rather than random. A radio placed in the kitchen would purportedly switch stations on its own, moving from music to static or turning on at high volume in the middle of the night. This specific detail is common in poltergeist literature, but in the Tallman case, it was accompanied by a reported drop in ambient temperature that was localized to specific rooms. Witnesses described walking through cold spots that were significantly lower in temperature than the surrounding air, despite the home's heating system functioning normally. These thermal anomalies were often precursors to more aggressive activity, serving as a warning system that the family eventually learned to recognize. The most disturbing element of the early phase involved the children's accounts. The youngest children began to speak of an old woman who would visit their room at night. Initially, the parents dismissed these accounts as night terrors or the product of active imaginations fueled by the shadows cast by the streetlights. However, the descriptions provided by the children were remarkably consistent. They described a small, elderly figure with long hair and a glowing or fire-like appearance who would sit on the edge of the bunk bed or stand in the corner of the room. The children's terror was visceral. They would wake up screaming, inconsolable, pointing at empty space. Debbie Tallman, attempting to soothe them, noted that the air in the room would often smell of ozone or something burning, despite there being no source of combustion in the house. Alan Tallman's skepticism was eroded by a specific incident involving a paintbrush. While painting a room in the house, he placed a paintbrush on a paint can and turned away for a moment. When he turned back, the brush was missing. After searching the immediate area, he reportedly found the brush standing upright, bristles down, in a container of paint thinner across the room. The distance and the orientation of the object made it physically impossible for it to have fallen or rolled into that position. This telekinetic displacement of objects became a recurring theme. Small items would disappear and reappear in illogical places. Windows that had been locked were found wide open. A chair in the living room was observed rocking violently on its own, stopping abruptly when a family member entered the room. The accumulated weight of these events began to take a severe toll on the psychological well-being of the parents, who were now sleep-deprived and living in a state of constant hypervigilance. The narrative of the Larrabee Street disturbance is distinguished by the involvement of extended family and, eventually, law enforcement. A relative of the Tallmans, who had been skeptical of the stories, offered to stay at the house to watch the children while the couple worked. During her stay, she reported a harrowing encounter that corroborated the children's descriptions. She claimed to have seen a hideous figure manifest in the bedroom, a figure she described as having the appearance of an old woman but with distorted features. The entity reportedly looked at her with malevolence before dissolving. This witness account was crucial, as it came from an adult outside the immediate nuclear family, lending credibility to the parents' claims that the phenomena were not a shared delusion induced by stress. As the weeks progressed into months, the activity centered increasingly on the bunk beds. The children refused to sleep in them, forcing the family to sleep together in the living room on the ground floor for safety. It was during one of these nights that the most dramatic event of the haunting reportedly occurred. Alan Tallman was sleeping on the floor with his family when he was awakened by a presence. In accounts later provided to researchers and the press, he described seeing a fog-like vapor rising from the floor. This vapor coalesced into the shape of a head and shoulders, glowing with a green luminescence. The eyes of the entity were described as red and burning. At the same time, a voice was heard disembodied and guttural, issuing a threat. The exact wording varies in different reports, but the sentiment was a command to leave. Following this visual manifestation, the garage door of the home began to open and close repeatedly, slamming with tremendous force that shook the foundation of the house. Terrified, Alan Tallman rushed to the garage to investigate, fearing an intruder or a mechanical failure. He found the garage empty, but the mechanism was engaging and disengaging rapidly. Upon returning to the living room, he found his family in hysterics. They had seen the fire-like apparition again, hovering near the ceiling. This event broke the family's resolve. It was no longer a matter of ignoring strange noises. They believed they were in physical danger. The decision was made to involve the police. This is a critical juncture in the case, distinguishing it from typical folklore where authorities are absent. The Tallmans called the Horicon Police Department not to report a ghost, but to report a disturbance they could not explain. Police Chief Doug Glaman arrived at the scene with other officers. The official police reports and subsequent interviews with Chief Glaman reveal a level of perplexity uncommon in law enforcement records. Officers inspected the home thoroughly, checking for intruders, pranksters, or mechanical faults. They found no evidence of forced entry. However, the officers themselves reported experiencing inexplicable phenomena while on the premises. There were reports of temperature drops so severe that they could see their breath inside the heated house. Officers noted a palpable sense of oppression and uneasiness. Chief Glaman later went on record stating that while he could not confirm the presence of a ghost, he was convinced that the Tallman family was genuinely terrified and that something inexplicable was occurring in the home. The validation from a credible, non-supernatural authority figure brought the case to the attention of the wider public. The involvement of the police did not quell the disturbances. If anything, the activities seemed to feed on the attention. The local community became aware of the situation, and the Tallman house became a subject of intense local speculation. Theories ranged from a cursed object to geological anomalies affecting the house's foundation. The University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh was contacted, and discussions regarding parapsychological investigation were held, though the family was primarily interested in resolution rather than research. They sought the help of clergy. A local pastor was invited to the home to perform a blessing. According to the family, the blessing seemed to antagonize the force within the house. The noises became louder, and the physical attacks, scratches appearing on the children's skin, objects being thrown intensified. The breaking point arrived in early 1988. The family had returned to the house after a brief period of staying with relatives, hoping the time away had reset the energy of the home. It had not. The bunk bed, which had been disassembled and stored in the basement in an attempt to isolate the cause, was still in the house. One evening, Alan Tallman reported being physically assaulted by an invisible force. He described being pushed or held down, a sensation of immense weight crushing his chest. Simultaneously, the children screamed from the other room, claiming the witch was back. Realizing that their physical safety could no longer be guaranteed, and fearing that the stress was causing irreparable harm to their children, the Tallmans made the decision to abandon the property. The family fled the house in the middle of a snowstorm, piling into their car with only the essentials. They drove to a relative's home, refusing to return to Larrabee Street that night. The departure was abrupt and absolute. In the days that followed, the story broke in the regional press. The Times, Milwaukee Sentinel-Times, and other local papers carried reports of the haunted bunk bed and the family fleeing their home. The sensation was immediate. Crowds began to gather outside the empty house, gawking at the windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural. The Tallmans, however, were done. They refused to spend another night in the residence. The resolution of the case centered on the object that had started it all, the bunk bed. Convinced that the furniture was the conduit for the entity or energy that had tormented them, the Tallmans decided it had to be destroyed. They did not sell it, nor did they return it to the shop, fearing that it would pass the curse on to another family. Instead, Alan Tallman transported the bed to a private landfill. There is a persistent local legend that the bed was burned, but other accounts suggest it was buried deep within the landfill, covered under tons of earth, and refused to ensure it would never be recovered. With the removal of the bed and the family's permanent relocation to a new residence, the activity at the Larrabee Street house ceased. Subsequent residents of the Larrabee Street home have reported no paranormal activity. The house stands today, indistinguishable from its neighbors, a silent witness to the events of 1987 to 1988. The abrupt cessation of the phenomena upon the Tallmans' departure and the destruction of the bed supports the theory that the haunting was attached either to the object or specifically to the family's interaction with it. Skeptics have proposed various explanations over the years. Some suggested that the haunting was a case of collective delusion fueled by financial stress or carbon monoxide poisoning, though the fire department found no evidence of gas leaks. Others suggested the wind sweeping off the Horicon Marsh caused drafts that slammed doors and that the children's illnesses were merely coincidental. However, these explanations fail to account for the specific, synchronized visual hallucinations reported by independent witnesses or the displacement of physical objects observed by the father. The psychological impact on the Tallman family was profound. They generally avoided the media spotlight in the years following the event, maintaining that what they experienced was real and traumatic. They did not seek to monetize their story through books or movie deals, a fact that lends significant weight to their credibility. They simply wanted to move on. The police reports from the incident remain in the archives, a testament to a time when a seasoned police chief and his officers responded to a call and found themselves confronting the unknown. The officers' refusal to dismiss the family's fears as insanity stands as a rare example of institutional validation in the field of paranormal research. In the annals of American hauntings, the Tallman House incident is distinct because of its containment. It had a clear beginning, the purchase of the bed, and a clear end, the disposal of the bed. It did not sprawl across decades or infect an entire neighborhood. It was a surgical strike on a single domestic unit. The narrative remains unsettling not because of the presence of ghosts, but because of the fragility of the domestic sphere it exposed. The idea that a simple purchase, a mundane object brought into a loving home, could carry with it a malign influence capable of dismantling a family's life is a fear that resonates deeply. It suggests that the walls we build to protect ourselves are permeable and that the history of objects can intrude upon the present with violent force. Researchers looking back at the case often focus on the bunk bed aspect, categorizing it as a Dybbuk box-style haunt or a psychometric event where an object retains the emotional resonance of a past trauma. Without the provenance of the bed, it is impossible to know what tragedy it may have witnessed before arriving at the secondhand shop in Horicon. Was it the site of a death, a crime? Or was it simply a focal point for the projection of the family's subconscious anxieties? The ambiguity remains. The image of the Tallman family fleeing into the Wisconsin winter, driven from their own home by a force they could not see but could vividly feel, remains a chilling tableau of the inexplicable. The Larrabee Street haunting serves as a documented case study of the siege phenomenon in parapsychology. Unlike a residual haunting, which plays out like a recording, the entity in Horicon was responsive. It reacted to the family's attempts to ignore it, escalating its activity until it achieved its apparent goal, the expulsion of the residents. The intelligence implied by this escalation, opening garage doors to lure the father away, appearing to the children to generate fear, suggests a level of agency that complicates simple environmental explanations. The snow that covered the tracks of the fleeing car has long since melted, but the questions raised by the Tallman case remain frozen in the record, unresolved and undeniably disturbing. Even today, when the story is retold in the local community, it is done so with a tone of hushed respect. The older residents remember the police cruisers parked on the street, the exhausted look on Alan Tallman's face, and the uncharacteristic silence of the children. They remember that for a few weeks in the winter of 1988, the impossible seemed to have taken up residence on Larrabee Street. And while the house is quiet now, the memory of the witch in the bunk bed and the green fog in the living room endures, a reminder that in the quietest towns, in the most ordinary houses, there are thresholds that, once crossed, can never be fully closed again. The narrative of the Tallman family is a sober reminder of the limits of our understanding. We rely on the laws of physics and the sanctity of our homes to provide order and safety. When those laws are violated, when the inanimate moves and the invisible speaks, the foundation of our reality fractures. The Tallmans survived their ordeal, but they were fundamentally changed by it. They learned that safety is an illusion and that the line between the natural and the supernatural is thinner than we care to admit. The Larrabee Street house remains a monument to that breach, a physical structure housing a history of fear that no amount of renovation can fully erase. It stands as a stark example of a high strangeness event occurring in a banal setting, proving that horror does not require a Gothic castle or a stormy coast. It requires only an open door and an unsuspecting family. The final aspect of the case worth noting is the silence of the aftermath. In many high-profile hauntings, the years following the event are filled with recantations, conflicting stories, or new claims of activity. The Tallman case has none of this. The silence from the family and the lack of subsequent activity in the house suggest a terrifying finality. Whatever was attached to that bed is gone, buried in the earth. But the implication that such a thing existed at all is a conclusion that defies the comfort of skepticism. It forces the researcher to confront the possibility that the Tallmans were not victims of a hoax or hysteria, but survivors of a genuine predatory anomaly. And if it happened once on Larrabee Street, the logical, terrifying corollary is that it could happen again, anywhere, to anyone who brings the wrong object home. A missing hiker's shoes were found 12 miles uphill. The first report was ordinary, until search crews logged a detail that didn't fit any normal timeline or terrain. In late September 2019, Ethan Marlowe, 34, a contract surveyor from Spokane, drove toward the Colville National Forest outside Republic, Washington. He told a coworker he needed a weekend alone, reportedly to clear his head before a work deadline. State records show his phone last pinged near the Sherman Pass area, then went quiet before dusk. Dispatch logs note a vehicle parked at a pullout, with no signs of mechanical trouble or theft. Ethan had experience on rough ground, and his employer confirmed he'd spent years walking timber tracks and steep cuts. County file from 2009 lists him as a witness in a minor road dispute, which investigators later referenced for background. Archived notes from a local sheriff's office describe him as calm, methodical, and not prone to impulsive disappearances. Some locals claimed he hunted and knew the forest like a map, though investigators never confirmed any hunting permits. Records conflict on whether he carried a GPS unit, and no receipt or registration was found for one. On the morning he vanished, the weather was unstable, with low cloud and intermittent rain across the ridges. According to dispatch logs, a ranger received a call about an overdue hiker around 7:40 p.m. placed by Ethan's sister in Coeur d'Alene. She said he promised to check in by noon, and he never missed that habit during previous solo trips. The call notes mention a planned loop, but the exact trail name varies across copies of the report. Search coordinators marked it as a moderate risk event because night temperatures were dropping fast. By the next day, volunteers from Ferry County and nearby Stevens County staged near Republic and began grid sweeps. A dog team reportedly tracked Ethan's scent along a creek crossing, then lost it on a rocky shelf above the drainage. Investigators later wrote that the shelf funneled wind, and that can scatter scent in ways handlers can't reliably interpret. Another team found boot prints in soft mud, but the tread pattern didn't match Ethan's work boots in family photos. The sheriff's summary says the prints could have been older because rainfall reworked the edges overnight. The first hard evidence came on day 3, when a volunteer spotted 2 shoes near a stand of subalpine fur. They were Ethan's, according to a manufacturer's stamp and wear marks described in state records. The odd part was the location, roughly 12 miles uphill from the nearest plausible approach, over broken ridgelines and loose talus. Dispatch logs show a brief pause in radio traffic after the coordinates were read aloud, followed by repeated confirmation requests. Investigators never confirmed a continuous track leading to the shoes, and no socks were recovered nearby. Search planners tried to build a timeline that made those miles possible, but the math didn't cooperate. A fit hiker can move fast, yet the elevation gain and terrain would slow most people to careful steps. Ethan's phone, if carried, should have registered some movement, but state records show no further tower contact after the first evening. Some locals claimed there were old logging cuts that could shorten the route, though maps in the county file show those cuts were badly overgrown. Records conflict about whether the shoes were dry or damp, which matters because rain moved through that slope the previous night. Investigators widened the search to include accidental injury, voluntary disappearance, and third-party involvement without naming any suspect. A ranger's archived notes mention hearing faint knocking sounds during a night sweep, but the notes also admit wind can mimic rhythm on dead snags. A helicopter crew reportedly spotted bright fabric near a scree field, yet the follow-up team found only a shredded tarp from an old camp. Dispatch logs indicate repeated false leads, each one draining hours and volunteer stamina. No blood, no torn pack, and no confirmed clothing were logged in the immediate shoe area. In early October 2019, the sheriff requested outside assistance, and state records show a small team reviewed communications and terrain models. They interviewed Ethan's coworkers, then cross-checked his bank activity for signs of planning or flight. Investigators noted normal spending, no large cash withdrawals, and no recent purchases of gear that would support a long absence. A brief entry in archived notes mentions an argument at work weeks earlier, though no one could produce a clear motive or threat. Records conflict on whether Ethan had a sleeping bag in his car, and photos of the back seat were never entered into evidence. The shoes became the center of the case because they suggested movement that didn't match Ethan's likely choices. If he removed them deliberately, it would slow him immediately and increase injury risk on sharp rock. If someone carried them, the person would have needed strength and purpose, yet no other footprints were confirmed around the drop site. Some locals claimed the shoes were staged to mislead crews, though investigators never confirmed tampering from the available photographs. Dispatch logs show officers discussing a second search line above the ridge, then calling it off after a sudden fog bank reduced visibility. By November 2019, the official search scaled back, and the file shifted into periodic review status. A county clerk entry shows the case remained open, with tips routed through a small unit in Republic. Archive notes mention a hunter later reporting a distant shout near a drainage, but investigators wrote that the timing and direction couldn't be verified. State records show that Ethan's car was released to the family, and no mechanical or forensic issue was documented in the final inventory. The report ends without a conclusion, because the only fixed point was those shoes, 12 miles uphill, waiting where no one expected them. The radio call that shouldn't exist. In late autumn 2019, a rescue channel in western Montana carried a voice nobody could place in records. The speaker used an identifier that dispatch logs said had been retired years earlier. County file from 2009 noted the same identifier after a fatal search near Missoula. Investigators never confirmed a source, yet archive notes show the calls kept returning. Evan Dorsey, 34, worked as a county radio technician based in Missoula County, and maintained repeaters for fire and EMS. He drove east toward the Sealy-Swan region to test a weak signal reported by volunteer responders. State records show his work order referenced a repeater scheduled for decommission in 2011. Some locals claimed the tower had been quiet since a lightning strike, but records conflict on the repair date. Tara Wynn, 29, served as a volunteer SAR coordinator and handled field check-ins for the Sealy Lake area. She joined because her team had logged 3 separate phantom transmissions over 2 weeks. Dispatch logs described the voice as calm and male, with clipped phrasing and standard procedure language. Reportedly, the signal rode the input frequency, not the output channel used by modern handheld radios. The first confirmed incident in archived notes occurred on a Sunday evening in early November 2019. A trainee at the Missoula Dispatch Center flagged a transmission that began with a unit number not on the roster. The caller requested a location check near a Forest Road junction, then stopped mid-sentence. Investigators never confirmed any unit in the field, and the CAD entry shows an immediate cancel. Evan reviewed the audio pulled from state records and compared it to known radio fingerprints. The squelch tail and carrier drop suggested a high site repeater, not a nearby handheld. He noted the identifier matched a discontinued call sign used before the county-wide upgrade. Tara requested a recheck because some locals claimed the voice sounded like an older deputy. They drove to Sealy Lake on a gray morning and met at the ranger station parking area. The station log shows their purpose as signal verification and equipment inspection only. Evan carried a spectrum analyzer and a spare mobile radio. Tara brought printed maps for sector grids. County file from 2009 lists the same parking lot as a staging point for a missing hunter case. The retired repeater site sat on a ridge above the Swan Valley, reachable by a service track. State records show the site had a battery bank removed in 2011. Evan expected dead air, yet his receiver showed intermittent bursts on the old input frequency. The bursts lasted 2 seconds each, then fell silent like a keyed mic released quickly. Tara called in their status on the modern channel and got a routine acknowledgement from dispatch. Immediately after, an overlapping voice appeared on the retired channel, using the old identifier again. The voice said it was en route to a subject last seen near water, then asked for a med unit. Dispatch logs show no operator transmitted back because the call landed outside their active talk group. Evan recorded the burst and noted the signal strength spiked as if from the ridge site. He checked the equipment shelter and found the door lock intact per the Ranger maintenance ledger. Inside, the rack was mostly empty, with only an old duplexer and a coax run still mounted. Some locals claimed scavengers had stripped everything years earlier, but archived notes list the duplexer as left in place. The next transmission came while they stood outside in light wind and steady drizzle. It began with breathing, then a steady voice that sounded practiced and restrained. The caller gave a time check and said he'd lost visual on a second party near timber. Investigators never confirmed any incident matching that description, and records conflict on whether the voice said timber or river. Tara asked Evan if the audio could be replayed through a crosspatch from another agency. Evan said it can't happen accidentally because patch tables are logged and audited. State records from 2011 show the old channel removed from the console templates, yet dispatch logs show the phantom identifier appeared in the console history, as if a legitimate unit selected it. They contacted a Forest Service dispatcher in the region and requested archive tower maintenance details. The dispatcher reportedly said the ridge site had been partially reactivated for training in 2018. Evan asked for the paperwork, and the dispatcher said none existed in their system. County file from 2009 mentions informal training use at that site, but investigators never confirmed it. Late that afternoon, Tara drove to a turnout above Sealy Lake to test line-of-sight reception. Evan stayed closer to the ridge track and monitored both the active and retired channels. At 16:07, a clear transmission hit the retired input and carried a full call for help. The voice gave coordinates using an older grid format, then said the injured person was fading fast. Tara relayed the coordinates to dispatch as a precaution using numeric degrees and minutes converted from the old grid. Dispatch logs show an immediate check with responding units, and no one was assigned to that coordinate set. Some locals claimed those coordinates matched a bend on the Clearwater River, but records conflict on the exact location. Investigators never confirmed any injured party, and no medical transport record appeared in state files. Evan attempted a controlled response on the retired channel using low power, saying he was reading the caller weekly. The voice replied instantly using Evan's name despite no introduction on that channel. Evan later told a supervisor he didn't know how his name could have been known from that frequency. Archive notes show Tara wrote that moment down in her field book, and the ink was later photographed for county records. The voice then shifted to procedure, requesting a helicopter and a specific tail number. Dispatch logs show that tail number belonged to a contracted aircraft used years earlier in the region. State records indicate the contract ended in 2009 after a budget reduction. Some locals claim they remembered that helicopter from news coverage, but investigators never confirmed the memory against flight manifests. Tara called dispatch again and asked for an aviation check, keeping her tone neutral and factual. The dispatcher said no aircraft were currently assigned and no request had been logged. Evan replayed the audio through his analyzer and saw a narrowband signature consistent with older equipment. The spectrum did not match modern P25 traffic, and it looked like an analog carrier keyed cleanly. They returned to Missoula after dark and submitted the recordings to the county communications supervisor. The supervisor placed the files into the incident archive per standard retention guidelines. County file from 2009 was pulled for comparison because it referenced the same old identifier. Investigators never confirmed the two events were linked, yet the waveform similarity was noted in archive notes. The 2009 file described a missing hunter near Ovando, reported by family after he failed to return. Dispatch logs from that year show a radio call from the same identifier requesting help on a back channel. A deputy reportedly drove toward the area and found an abandoned truck, but no person was located. Records conflict on whether the deputy heard a second call because two transcripts differ by 3 lines. Evan requested tower access logs for the ridge site and found no entries for several months. The ranger district said the logbook was stored off-site and would take time to retrieve. Tara contacted a volunteer team leader who said he'd heard the phantom voice in his own handheld speaker. The leader said, "I don't scare easy," and he refused to repeat the words on record. State records show Evan ran a bench test on his spare mobile radio 2 days later. He verified the radio could not scan into the retired channel unless manually programmed. He then checked programming templates used by local agencies and found the retired channel absent. Investigators never confirmed how field radios were hearing the transmissions because no standardized scan lists matched. A week later, dispatch logs recorded another phantom call during an otherwise quiet overnight shift. The call began with the same identifier and asked for law enforcement backup near a lakeshore. The voice said someone was not breathing, then stopped as if the mic was taken away. Some locals claimed it sounded like a struggle, but archive notes say the audio stayed even and controlled. Tara requested the CAD audit trail and found the entry created, then edited, then closed within 1 minute. The audit trail showed a console position that was not staffed at that time. The supervisor said the system can't create entries without an active login. Records conflict because a later printout showed a different console ID, and investigators never confirmed which was correct. Evan visited the dispatch center and reviewed console configuration with the vendor support technician. The technician reportedly said ghost events can appear during database replication issues. Evan asked why the audio also existed, and the technician said audio logs are separate and shouldn't follow CAD glitches. State records include a short email chain where the vendor suggested rare synchronization artifacts without providing a mechanism. To isolate the source, Evans set up a receiver in an RF-shielded environment and fed it from a controlled antenna. He expected clean silence, but the phantom transmission appeared again at the same time as in dispatch logs. The signal arrived with directional characteristics consistent with a distant high site. Investigators never confirmed the arrival path because the county had no direction finding team on call. Tara and Evan then interviewed a retired deputy who worked the Ovando case in 2009. The deputy said he remembered the identifier as a unit tied to a small rural station. He said the unit was reassigned after an incident, and he wouldn't describe it on camera. County file from 2009 includes a redacted paragraph that begins with radio traffic anomaly, then cuts off. Some locals claim the identifier belonged to a single deputy who died on duty, but investigators never confirmed a matching death record. State records show a line-of-duty death in the region years earlier, yet the name did not match any radio roster tied to that identifier. Dispatch logs list the identifier as inactive, not memorial. Records conflict because a separate spreadsheet labeled it retired for policy reasons with no explanation. In early December 2019, the county held a closed meeting to discuss the repeated transmissions. Evan presented frequency plots, tower maps, and time-stamped audio comparisons. Tara presented field notes and the coordinate conversions that had been relayed to dispatch. Archive notes show the meeting ended with a directive to lock the retired channel out of all consoles, if possible. After the lockout, dispatch logs still captured the phantom identifier, but only as raw audio without CAD entries. The voice called twice in one night, then disappeared for 14 days. When it returned, the message was shorter and sounded like a status update to nobody. Investigators never confirmed whether the lockout reduced activity because the sample size was small and records conflict on timing. Evan later traced one possible route through a microwave link that had been left in place after the upgrade. The link connected a legacy site to a newer hub, and a misconfigured gateway could leak analog audio. Vendor documentation reportedly allowed for test loops, but only with physical jumpers installed. Evan checked the hub and found no jumpers, yet the gateway showed intermittent activity. Tara filed a public records request for the 2009 case and received a packet with heavy redactions. The packet included an archived note stating the identifier should not exist on current systems. Another page referenced archived dispatch audio retained beyond policy, without explaining why. Some locals claimed the county was hiding a failure, but investigators never confirmed intent or motive. By spring 2020, the phantom calls had stopped, according to dispatch logs reviewed later. Evans' work order closed with no fault found, and the Ridge site remained mostly offline. Tara's field notebook was scanned into county files, then returned to her as personal property. Records conflict on the final count of transmissions because separate logs list totals of 7 and 11. The last recorded audio, preserved in archived notes, contained only one sentence and a clean carrier drop. The voice said it had eyes on the water and would hold until you arrive. No location followed, and no unit acknowledged the call in any available record. Investigators never confirmed whether anyone arrived anywhere because no matching incident report was filed. The county file from 2009 remains cross-referenced, and the identifier remains listed as inactive. A man disappeared while his friends watched, and no one can explain how. On a mild Saturday in late September, 3 friends drove from Brevard into Pisgah National Forest for a short hike. They returned without Jonah Mercer, and none of them agreed on the same timeline afterward. Dispatch logs show the first call came before sunset, reported as a missing adult near a well-known trail junction. By the time rangers arrived, the story had already started to split into versions. Jonah Mercer was 31, an IT support specialist in Asheville, and he'd been training for a charity half marathon. His friends were Ethan Rowe, 33, a diesel mechanic, and Paige Landry, 29, a nursing assistant at a regional clinic. County file from 2009 lists Ethan as a volunteer searcher in an older missing case, which later mattered. Archived notes suggest Page was the one who picked the route, a familiar loop near a creek. They parked near Brevard and started walking after lunch, according to a statement later summarized in state records. The plan was simple: reach a viewpoint, eat, then return before the temperature dropped. Reportedly, Jonah carried a small day pack, a rain shell, and a phone with a partially charged battery. Ethan carried a basic first aid kit, and Paige brought 2 water bottles and a headlamp. The trail that day was not empty, and multiple hikers later told investigators they saw the trio pass. One witness recalled Jonah laughing, and another remembered Paige pointing at a posted map. Investigators never confirmed the exact minute they reached the creek crossing because records conflict across interviews. Still, the statements match on one detail: Jonah was behind them by only a few steps. At the creek, the 3 paused on flat rocks where the water spread into shallow channels. Ethan later said Jonah stepped onto a stone that shifted, then hopped back onto dry ground. Paige later said Jonah never slipped, and she insisted he was calm and joking. Both agreed. They stopped for maybe a minute, listening for other hikers behind them. Then both claimed Jonah moved toward a patch of brush beside the waterline. What happened next is the part that never stabilized, even after formal interviews. Ethan told a deputy that Jonah took 3 steps into the brush, then disappeared like he'd walked through a curtain. Paige told a ranger Jonah turned his shoulders as if he heard someone call him from upstream. Investigators never confirmed any additional voice, and no other witness reported shouting near the crossing. The county file notes the phrase "watched him vanish," but it is followed by a question mark. In the first 911 call, reportedly made by Paige, she said her friend had wandered off trail and was not responding. In a second call, minutes later, Ethan said Jonah was right there, and then he wasn't, and he sounded shaken. Dispatch logs show the operator asked if Jonah might be injured, and both callers answered they didn't know. Records conflict on whether the callers described the brush as thick or sparse, which later shaped search patterns. A ranger unit arrived from Brevard and started at the creek crossing with 2 volunteers. State records list the initial weather as clear, with damp ground near the water and no heavy wind. A tracking dog was requested, but an archive note says the handler was an hour away. Paige and Ethan were kept on the trail, and they were told not to move through the brush. They both complied, according to the first incident report. The earliest photos in the file show flat stones, low rhododendron, and a narrow path where someone had stepped. Investigators never confirmed those prints were Jonah's because the area had foot traffic that afternoon. Some locals claimed the creek area had confusing side paths, but trail maintenance records show no reroute in that season. The ranger report mentions a faint odor of smoke from a distant campsite, and that detail later fed rumors. A deputy from Transylvania County arrived and took separate statements in the parking area. The deputy noted Ethan's hands were scraped, which Ethan said came from grabbing branches while calling Jonah's name. Paige had wet pant cuffs, and she said she stepped into the creek while looking upstream. Both said Jonah had no reason to leave the trail, and both insisted he wasn't intoxicated. Investigators never confirmed any alcohol use, and no containers were found in their gear. As daylight faded, searchers expanded along the creek, then up 2 short ridges on either side. A state records entry lists 1 volunteer hearing a single whistle, then nothing further. That volunteer could not confirm the direction, and no other team heard it. Some locals claimed whistles were common on weekends, used by hikers to locate companions. Investigators never confirmed a whistle tied to Jonah, and it remains a disputed detail. A tracking dog arrived after dark and worked near the stones for several minutes. The handler reportedly told a ranger the dog showed interest near the water, then lost the trail abruptly. Archived notes caution that running water can confuse scent, especially with multiple people moving nearby. The dog then circled a cluster of rhododendron and stopped, refusing to push farther. Investigators never confirmed whether that behavior indicated scent loss or simple fatigue. By midnight, the search included volunteers from nearby counties and a small thermal drone team. The drone footage, summarized in a later memo, showed no heat source consistent with an adult body in open terrain. Dense canopy, limited visibility, and the creek corridor produced pockets of false readings from wet rock. The memo also notes that Jonah's phone did not ping reliably in that drainage. Records conflict on whether a brief signal was detected around 10:30, but it could not be repeated. The next morning, the operation shifted to daylight grid searches with teams assigned to map squares. State records list the command post near Brevard, and the incident commander requested a helicopter if weather stayed clear. A volunteer team found a torn piece of snack wrapper near the crossing, but investigators never confirmed it belonged to Jonah. Another team reported finding a fresh scuff on a rock face, though photos did not settle the question. The county file calls these items non-probative, meaning they proved little either way. Ethan and Paige were interviewed again, this time with a ranger investigator present. Ethan said he watched Jonah's back, then Jonah stepped behind a bush and never reappeared. Paige said she watched Jonah's feet, and she claimed his shoes stayed visible until they didn't. Investigators never confirmed how a person could vanish within that line of sight, but they also noted stress distorts memory. Records conflict on the distance, with estimates ranging from 5 feet to 15. A third witness emerged on day 2, a hiker from Hendersonville who said he passed the trio earlier. He told investigators Jonah asked about the creek crossing, and he mentioned slippery stones. That hiker later said he heard shouting around dusk, then saw 2 people waving on the trail. Dispatch logs support that there was yelling, but they do not describe content. Investigators never confirmed the witness saw Jonah after the crossing, and his account ends before the disappearance window. On day 3, search teams focused downstream, where a fall could carry a body into brushy bends. Divers were not initially used because water depth was low and visibility was poor. Archive notes include a discussion about sudden sinkholes, but geology maps showed no known collapse feature at that site. Some locals claimed there were old logging pits nearby, covered by leaves and moss. Investigators never confirmed any pit close enough to explain the sightline problem. The sheriff's office requested Jonah's phone records, and a limited summary appears in a state records appendix. It shows brief activity earlier that afternoon, then no outgoing calls after the hike began. There was a single unsent text draft, reportedly typed around 3, that read almost like a reminder. Investigators never confirmed Jonah wrote it, because drafts can persist from earlier days. The phone itself was never recovered, so the data remains partial. A week later, the case shifted from rescue to recovery, a change reflected in county file language. The incident commander wrote that probability of survival had dropped due to exposure risk and lack of contact. Yet the weather had been mild, and that fact kept the case from closing emotionally. Some locals claimed Jonah was seen at a gas station in Brevard days later, but investigators never confirmed the report. The tip was logged, then marked unfounded, with no surveillance match. Attention turned to Ethan and Paige not as suspects in a crime, but as sources of inconsistent detail. They had been close friends with Jonah for years, and there was no reported conflict on the drive. Still, investigators asked about finances, relationships, and any reason Jonah might stage a disappearance. Both denied any motive, and neither had recent legal trouble in state records. Investigators never confirmed any plan to leave, and Jonah had upcoming work shifts on the calendar. A small detail in archived notes became a recurring point. Jonah's shoes were described differently in 2 interviews. Ethan said trail runners with bright soles, and Paige said hiking shoes, darker and heavier. Records conflict on which description matched photos Jonah posted online weeks earlier. Investigators never confirmed what he wore that day because no clear pre-hike photo existed. Some locals claimed a shoe was found months later, but the county file shows no tagged evidence entry for it. In early October, a ranger documented faint drag marks near a narrow chute leading away from the creek. The marks could have been made by deer, dogs, or human boots, and the report uses reportedly more than once. A team followed the chute to a steep bank, then stopped at exposed rock and scattered leaf litter. No blood was found, and no torn cloth was recovered in that segment. Investigators never confirmed the drag marks were related, and later Rains erased them. A wildlife theory was raised quietly, then discussed in a later memorandum. Black bears are present in Pisgah, and there have been incidents, though they are uncommon. The memo notes no signs of a struggle, no scent indications from the dog, and no confirmed animal tracks at the crossing. Some locals claimed the area had aggressive boars, but wildlife officers did not confirm that pattern. Investigators never confirmed predation, and the file avoids stating it as a likely cause. Another theory involved a medical event, a sudden seizure, cardiac issue, or fainting spell near unstable ground. Jonah had no known condition in the limited medical history shared, according to the family's statement. Still, a fall into shallow water can produce disorientation, and a person can move unpredictably in panic. Investigators never confirmed a fall because the stones showed no definitive impact mark. Records conflict on whether Jonah's clothes were wet before he stepped toward the brush. Months later, a volunteer found a water bottle wedged between rocks downstream, and it was logged as potential evidence. The label was common, and no fingerprints were usable, according to a brief note. The bottle's location could fit the creek theory, yet it could also reflect ordinary litter. Some locals claimed the bottle was Jonah's because the cap color matched Page's description. Investigators never confirmed ownership, and the item did not change search posture. In 2020, the sheriff's office reviewed the case file and added a summary page for archival storage. That page notes the disappearance occurred within sight, yet no corroborating witness confirmed the moment. It lists key uncertainties, the dog's abrupt scent loss, inconsistent footwear descriptions, and unverified reports of later sightings. The summary avoids conclusions, and it ends with a line about records conflict. Jonah Mercer remains missing, and the creek crossing remains the last confirmed location in state records. Years later, hikers still mention the story in Brevard cafes, usually in lowered voices and with careful qualifiers. Some locals claimed the forest takes people, but investigators never confirmed anything beyond a missing adult. Dispatch logs, state records, archive notes, and the county file from 2009 all circle the same hard fact. Two friends said they watched a man step away, and they could not explain how he failed to come back. The file stays open because the evidence never becomes final. A search helicopter refused to fly over this section of forest. In late October of 2019, a search team in Josephine County watched a helicopter turn away from dark timber. They had a missing man, fresh tracks, and a weather window that should have helped. Reportedly, the pilot came on the radio and refused one specific drainage by name. Dispatch logs show the denial happened twice, minutes apart, with ground units already staged nearby. Records conflict on why it happened, and that gap became the center of the case. Evan Carver was 34, a contract survey technician from Medford, working a short job outside Grants Pass that week. He spent his days marking property corners, then hiking after work to clear his head. On Friday afternoon, he drove toward the Rogue River area with a small pack and one headlamp. A coworker later told investigators Evan planned a quick loop, then dinner back in town. State records show his phone last pinged near Merlin, then went silent without further network hits. The county file from 2009 lists that drainage as rugged, with steep benches and confusing game trails. A second person matters because Evan did not start alone, at least not according to archive notes. Maya Lopez was 29, a pharmacy tech from Grants Pass, and she had met Evan through friends months earlier. She reportedly joined him for the first mile, then turned back after a knee flare-up. Her statement stayed consistent on time, but investigators never confirmed her exact turnaround point. She said Evan kept going, calm and unhurried, and promised to text when he reached the car again. Dispatch logs later show responders considered her the last reliable witness, yet records conflict on whether she walked partway again. The first call came from a small market clerk in Merlin who noticed Evan's truck still parked after closing. A deputy checked the area around 10 p.m., then filed a welfare note rather than a missing report. By sunrise, Maya had called twice, reportedly crying, and asked that a search be started. County radio traffic shows the report was upgraded mid-morning after a canine handler found fresh scent near a faint footpath. Some locals claimed they saw a lone headlamp deeper in the trees around midnight, though investigators never confirmed that sighting. The first official search grid began before noon, with volunteers arriving from Grants Pass and Cave Junction. Terrain became the immediate problem, according to state records and archived notes from prior rescues. The area was a patchwork of private timber, BLM land, and steep ravines cut by seasonal creeks. The ground team found boot impressions in soft duff, then lost them on rock slabs near a narrow draw. A handler reportedly said the dog pulled hard downhill, then circled and stalled near thick vine maple. Investigators wrote that wind shifted sharply in that pocket and scent could have pooled or vanished. Even so, they requested an air asset, expecting a quick infrared sweep before clouds moved in. The helicopter arrived from a nearby base in the afternoon, with a pilot and a crew member trained for rescue support. Dispatch logs show the aircraft made 2 passes over the broader valley, then angled toward the drainage where the dog had signaled. The refusal happened while the aircraft was still high, before any obvious hazard was called from the ground. Reportedly, the pilot said, "I'm not flying over that section today," and asked for an alternate route. Ground supervisors pressed for clarification, but the radio exchange stayed brief and tense. In one archived note, a sergeant wrote that the pilot sounded certain, as if repeating a policy rather than making a judgment. Records conflict on whether the crew member tried to add details because the audio file is incomplete. After the refusal, ground teams adjusted their plan and pushed harder into the drainage on foot. They moved in pairs, marking tape and calling Evan's name at set intervals. A volunteer later told a reporter the woods felt normal until they crossed an invisible line, then everything went still. That description never appeared in the official narrative, and investigators did not endorse it. Dispatch logs do show radio discipline tightened at that moment, with fewer casual transmissions. Some locals claimed the silence came from an old marijuana grow area, but county deputies never confirmed active sites during that weekend. At dusk, one team found a water bottle that matched Evan's brand preference, according to Maya's interview. It sat upright on a flat rock beside a trickle of water with no dirt on the cap. Searchers photographed it, bagged it, and logged the location for follow-up in daylight. State records show no usable fingerprints were recovered, which can happen outdoors for mundane reasons. Still, the placement raised questions because it looked deliberate rather than dropped. Investigators wrote that Evan could have paused there, then continued into thicker cover. The dog was brought back to that point, reportedly showing interest, then pulling again toward the same forbidden drainage. Morning brought low clouds and a cold drizzle, yet conditions were still workable for short aviation windows. The incident commander asked again for air support, and the same helicopter crew was available. Dispatch logs show a second refusal, again tied to the same small section of forest. This time, the pilot referenced wind and turbulence, yet weather reports from nearby stations showed moderate gusts, not extreme. Records conflict because a volunteer spotter reported calmer air at ridgeline, while the pilot described sudden downdrafts. Investigators never confirmed with flight data since that information was not attached to the county file. Ground teams were told to continue without aerial coverage, stretching resources across a wider grid. Maya remained at the staging area, answering questions and checking her phone for any new message. She reportedly repeated that Evan had been upbeat, with no mention of self-harm or risky plans. Deputies requested bank activity checks, then wrote that nothing changed after Friday afternoon. State records show his vehicle had normal contents, including a jacket and a second pair of shoes. That detail mattered later, because some locals claimed Evan planned an overnight camp, which would have required more gear. Investigators never confirmed those claims, and the archive notes treat them as rumor. A county file from 2009 mentions prior lost hikers in the same region, often due to simple navigation errors rather than drama. On the third day, searchers found a single shoe print in mud near a fallen log, deeper than earlier tracks. It matched the tread pattern of Evan's boots, at least according to an annotated photo in the case packet. The print faced uphill, which suggested he might have tried to climb out of a ravine. Nearby, they found a torn corner of a topographic map, wet and folded. Reportedly, Evan carried paper maps for work, so the find looked plausible. Investigators never confirmed the map corner belonged to him because the paper had no names or marks. Still, the location lined up with the drainage the helicopter avoided, which kept the same uncomfortable focus. One deputy wrote a short entry about a conversation with the pilot after the second refusal. In that note, the pilot reportedly said, "I've been briefed before, and I'm not going in there." The wording was vague, and state records do not include any formal briefing document. Some locals claimed the area was used for training flights and had strict no-fly rules, but investigators never confirmed an active restriction. County officials later told reporters there was no published temporary flight limitation at that time. Records conflict again because a volunteer ham operator said he heard a separate aircraft warn of hazards, yet no transcript exists. The case file treats the helicopter decision as a safety call, but it does not show how that conclusion was reached. Ground teams expanded the perimeter, checking logging spurs and creek crossings where an injured person might drift. They searched abandoned camps, culverts, and brushy slopes that could hide a body from casual view. Dispatch logs show several false alarms, including a tarp that looked like clothing from a distance. A K-9 team reportedly alerted near a stump hollow, then lost interest after handlers repositioned. Investigators wrote that wind and rain made scent work unreliable, and that is a common limitation. Still, the repeated pull toward the same drainage kept returning in the notes. By day 5, volunteer numbers dropped, and the search shifted from rescue to recovery language in county communications. A month later, a hunter contacted the sheriff's office with a story about hearing a whistle deep in the trees. He said it happened near the same drainage just after sunrise, with fog sitting low in the ravine. Investigators interviewed him, then filed the report as unconfirmed due to distance and poor visibility. Reportedly, the hunter also mentioned a helicopter that never flew overhead, which suggests the story traveled locally. County file annotations show the tip was revisited once, then closed without a new field push. Records conflict because another local later claimed the hunter changed details, but that claim is also unverified. No physical evidence came from that tip, yet it stayed in the rumor network around Merlin and Grants Pass. In 2020, Evan's family requested public records, and portions of dispatch logs were released with redactions. Those logs confirm the refusals occurred, but they do not include the full audio that would explain tone and context. Archived notes show the incident commander asked for reasons, and the pilot kept answers short. Investigators later wrote that helicopter safety decisions can override mission need, especially near rotors and steep terrain. That is true in general, yet the file does not show a weather spike or mechanical issue that would single out one drainage. Some locals claimed the aircraft had a prior incident there, but investigators never confirmed any matching report. The uncertainty left space for stories to grow, while the concrete facts stayed thin and stubborn. A separate thread involved private timber operations because the drainage cut across active harvest units. State records show permission was requested to access certain roads, and the answer was granted with conditions. A supervisor reportedly told deputies that heavy equipment moved through earlier, which could erase tracks. Investigators noted the possibility, then wrote that they found no clear signs of recent grading at the key track site. Records conflict again because a volunteer photographer captured tire ruts in a nearby clearing, though the timestamp could not be verified. The helicopter refusal made some residents suspect a corporate restriction, yet there is no written rule in the county file. The simplest explanation remained turbulence, but the documentation does not fully support it. Maya was interviewed again in 2021, and her account gained small details that were hard to reconcile. She reportedly said Evan mentioned an old mine feature on the map, though she could not name it. Investigators never confirmed a mine entrance in that exact drainage, but archived notes mention adits in the broader region. She also said Evan's headlamp was new, bright enough to be seen from far away, which matched the earlier headlamp rumor. Records conflict on timing because her phone records show calls during the window she claimed to be driving home. The detective wrote that memory under stress can shift, and that explanation was placed in the file without further conclusion. Her role stayed uncertain, yet no evidence tied her to wrongdoing, and no charges were ever suggested in state records. The case became a reference point for local search volunteers, partly because of what did not happen from the air. In training meetings, some leaders reportedly cited it as a reminder that aircraft are not guaranteed support. Others treated it as a cautionary tale about assumptions in rugged pockets of Josephine County. Dispatch logs, state records, and archive notes show a pattern of effort, yet also a pattern of missing connective tissue. Investigators never confirmed whether the helicopter crew had prior intelligence, a safety memo, or a personal rule. The county file from 2009 is cited repeatedly as if older incidents were shaping modern decisions. That linkage may be practical, yet it also suggests institutional memory can become an unspoken map. In 2022, a hiker found a faded work glove near a creek bend and turned it in. It matched the size Evan wore, according to a family statement in the supplemental notes. The glove had no unique markings, and lab results reportedly found no DNA suitable for comparison. Investigators logged it, then wrote that the creek could carry items from upstream over years. Some locals claimed the find proved Evan reached the forbidden drainage, yet investigators never confirmed the glove's origin. Records conflict because the discovery site was described two different ways, one as upstream, one as downstream. The ambiguity kept the find from closing the case, leaving it as another loose object in a long file. By 2023, the official narrative had settled into careful language that avoided conclusions. The sheriff's office described Evan as missing, with circumstances unclear and no confirmed sightings after Friday. They referenced terrain, weather, and limited resources, and those factors are supported by dispatch logs. The helicopter refusals remained documented, but still unexplained in a way that satisfied everyone. Some locals claimed they knew the real reason, yet their stories never aligned, and investigators never confirmed any single account. The family continued periodic searches, guided by maps and old GPS points from volunteer teams. Each time, the same drainage drew attention, because it was the place the aircraft would not cross. In the end, the strangest feature of the case is not a mystery creature or a ghost story, but an administrative silence. A pilot refused a patch of forest, and the file never clearly states why that patch was different. Dispatch logs show the refusals, state records show the search effort, and archive notes show the questions asked. The county file from 2009 adds background, yet it does not provide a direct rule for 2019. Records conflict across witnesses, and investigators never confirmed the most dramatic claims circulating in Merlin and Grants Pass. Evan Carver remains missing, and the most solid fact is a boundary in the air that nobody fully explained on paper. Next story. The Siege of the Little Men. There is a specific kind of darkness that blankets the rural American South in late summer. It is not just an absence of light, but a heavy, suffocating presence, thick with the humidity of August and the deafening drone of cicadas. In the farming community of Kelly, Kentucky, the nights belong to the cornfields. The towering stalks sway in the warm breeze, creating a wall of shadows that stretches for miles in every direction. If you scream out there, the sound is swallowed by the earth. If something approaches from the depths of those fields, you will not see it until it is standing right at your door. On the evening of August 21st, 1955, 11 people were crammed inside the small, unpainted Sutton farmhouse. It was a modest home, devoid of running water or a telephone, sitting isolated at the end of a long dirt driveway. The family was winding down from a long day of brutal heat. Around 7 in the evening, a visiting friend named Billy Ray Taylor stepped out the back door to draw a bucket of water from the well. He barely made it to the pump. He came rushing back inside, his face pale and slick with sweat, claiming he had just watched a massive, glowing metallic object streak across the twilight sky and land silently in a deep gully just beyond the edge of the property. The others in the house dismissed him. They reasoned it was a shooting star or perhaps a trick of the fading light. Billy Ray insisted, but the stifling heat of the house sapped any energy for argument. The matter was dropped until the farm dog in the yard began to bark. It was not the usual territorial warning. It was a frantic, terrified shrieking that ended abruptly as the animal scrambled under the foundation of the house, refusing to come out. A heavy silence fell over the property, drowning out even the chorus of the insects. Elmer Lucky Sutton, the patriarch of the house, exchanged a long look with Billy Ray. Neither man spoke, but both moved toward the corner of the room. Lucky picked up his 12-gauge shotgun. Billy Ray took up a .22 caliber hunting rifle. They loaded the chambers, the metallic clatter of the mechanism sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet house. They opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch, peering into the dense blackness of the yard. At first, there was only the rustling of the corn, then they saw it. Emerging from the tree line, roughly 40 feet away, was a faint, luminous glow. As it moved closer, the glow took the shape of a figure. It was small, perhaps 3 feet tall, with an oversized head and massive, glowing yellow eyes that sat flush against the sides of its face. Its arms were grotesquely long, spindly appendages ending in sharp talons that nearly dragged on the grass. The most unnatural thing was the way it moved. It did not walk. It seemed to float, gliding over the uneven ground with a swaying, weightless motion, its hands raised in the air as if surrendering, yet it kept coming steadily toward the men. Fear, primal and cold, gripped the two men. When the creature closed the distance to roughly 20 feet, Lucky raised the shotgun. At that range, a 12-gauge blast is utterly devastating. He pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the gunshot shattered the quiet night, a massive burst of flame illuminating the yard. The buckshot struck the creature squarely in the chest. But there was no blood. There was no tearing of flesh. Instead, a sharp, ringing sound echoed across the yard. Tring. It sounded exactly like a bullet striking an empty metal bucket. The force of the blast flipped the creature backward in a somersault, but it did not scream. It merely righted itself, uninjured, and scrambled away into the deep shadows on all fours, moving with the terrifying speed of an insect. Lucky and Billy Ray backed into the house, slamming the wooden door and throwing the deadbolt. Panic erupted inside. The women grabbed the frightened children, dragging them into the center of the house, away from the exterior walls. The home had instantly transformed from a sanctuary into a wooden box, surrounded on all sides by an impenetrable dark. They turned off all the lamps, plunging the rooms into pitch blackness to avoid silhouetting themselves against the windows. The men positioned themselves at the glass, their hands trembling, gripping their weapons so tightly their knuckles ached. The siege had begun. For several agonizing minutes, there was nothing. Then, a soft scraping sound came from the dining room window. Lucky moved cautiously toward the doorway. Framed in the glass, pressed directly against the pane, was a pale, glowing face. The enormous yellow eyes stared unblinking into the dark house. Billy Ray fired the rifle right through the glass. The window exploded outward in a shower of shards. The bullet found its mark, but again, the sound of metal striking metal rang out. The creature simply dropped out of sight, disappearing below the sill. The men realized they had to ensure the perimeter was clear. They crept out the front door, stepping onto the small concrete porch, aiming their weapons into the yard. As Billy Ray took a step forward, a clawed hand reached down from the low, overhanging awning of the roof. Pale fingers twisted violently into his hair, pulling him upward. The women inside screamed. Lucky spun around, shoved his shotgun barrel upward toward the roof, and fired blindly. Another metallic ricochet cut through the smoke. The grip released, and the creature tumbled onto the ground, quickly scurrying out of sight into the brush. They retreated inside once more, barricading the door. It was then that the true horror of their situation settled over them. Their weapons, the heavy firearms designed to stop a man or a wild beast in its tracks, were entirely useless. They were trapped miles from town, surrounded by a sea of corn, defending their family against entities that could not be killed. Then came the sound. The farmhouse roof was made of corrugated tin. The thin metal amplified every movement above them. It started as a soft pressure, the creak of weight settling onto the panels. Then the scraping began. The sharp, rhythmic drag of talons moving across the ridges of the tin roof. Scrape, drag, scrape. The family sat frozen in the center of the living room, breathing in the stale air and the acrid smell of spent sulfur, listening as the weightless footsteps paced back and forth directly over their heads. They could hear multiple creatures up there communicating in strange, high-pitched chattering noises. Every few minutes, a glowing face would slowly rise at one of the windows, peek inside, and duck away before the men could raise their guns. The psychological torture of the invasion wore them down. The constant scratching, the terrifying metallic ping of their useless bullets, the glowing eyes in the dark. By 11 at night, the terror reached a breaking point. The family could no longer endure the claustrophobia of the dark house. On a desperate signal, all 11 people bolted from the front door, piling violently into the two family cars parked in the yard. They turned the keys, the engines roaring to life, and sped down the dirt driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of dust as they fled toward the highway. They drove blindly into the city of Hopkinsville, arriving at the police station in a state of absolute hysteria. The police chief noted that these were hardened country people, yet they were trembling so violently they could barely speak. The children were catatonic with fear. Recognizing the genuine terror in their eyes, the chief assembled a massive response. City police, state troopers, and military police from the nearby Fort Campbell Army Base formed a heavily armed caravan and drove back to the Kelly farmhouse. They arrived to find the property silent. The officers scoured the yard with high-powered flashlights. They found the shattered window. They found dozens of spent shotgun shells and rifle casings littering the grass. They noticed a strange, luminous patch on the ground where one of the creatures had been shot and knocked over, a patch that glowed faintly green in the beam of their flashlights. But there were no bodies. There were no tracks. Finding no immediate threat, and assuming the trespassers had fled, the vast police presence slowly packed up and left. The last cruiser rolled down the dirt driveway at roughly 2:15 in the morning, leaving the exhausted Sutton family alone once again. The family locked the doors and huddled together in the living room, desperately hoping the nightmare was over. The house was quiet, the crickets had begun to chirp again. The heavy southern heat pressed down on the roof. Then, at 3:30 in the morning, a soft scrape echoed from the kitchen. Lucky turned his head slowly. Rising steadily from the bottom edge of the broken kitchen window, bathed in a faint, sickly glow, were two massive yellow eyes. The scratching on the tin roof resumed. The metallic drag of claws echoed through the wooden rafters. The creatures had merely waited in the high corn for the police to leave. The siege continued for another 2 hours. The men fired their remaining ammunition, listening in despair to the agonizing, hollow ping of bullets bouncing off the unearthly invaders. The family sat helpless in the dark, watching the shadows move outside, waiting for the walls to give way. It was not until the first faint light of dawn broke over the horizon at 5 in the morning that the creatures finally retreated, slipping back into the deep woods and the endless rows of corn, never to be seen again. The Sutton family did not stay to see another night. They packed their belongings and abandoned the farmhouse shortly after. They left behind a home scarred by bullet holes and shattered glass, and a quiet farming town that would never completely wash away the stain of that August night. But worst of all, they carried away the lingering memory of the dark, the useless weight of a loaded gun, and the endless, terrifying sound of claws dragging across a metal roof. The Solitude of St. Mary's and the Marshes of Langenhoe. The coastal landscape of Essex, specifically the region bordering the marshes where the land dissolves into the tidal estuaries of the River Colne and the Blackwater, possesses a distinct and oppressive atmosphere that has been documented for centuries. This geography is characterized by flatness, a horizon that seems to retreat indefinitely, and a silence that is often described as having a physical weight. In the early 20th century, the village of Langenhoe was a small, isolated community within this expanse, dominated by the presence of St. Mary's Church. The church stood alone, separated from the main cluster of village houses, positioned on a slight rise of ground that made it vulnerable to the winds sweeping in from the North Sea. By the late 1930s, the structure was already showing signs of significant age and weathering, stemming from centuries of exposure to the saline air and the shifting clay soil of the marshes. It is within this setting that the Reverend Ernest Merriweather arrived in 1937 to take up the position of rector, unaware that his tenure would become the primary source for one of the most concentrated periods of paranormal documentation in British history. Merriweather was not a man easily given to superstition or flights of fancy, described by contemporaries as a practical, somewhat stoic individual who viewed his duties with a serious, grounded demeanor. His initial impressions of Langenhoe were focused on the physical challenges of the parish, primarily the structural integrity of the church and the isolation of the rectory. However, the local population, which had dwindled significantly over the preceding decades, held a deeply ingrained set of beliefs regarding the church grounds, beliefs that they were hesitant to articulate to the new arrival. The folklore of the area had long suggested that the church was built upon a site of ancient significance, possibly predating Christian worship, and that the land itself retained a memory that was occasionally hostile to human presence. The first recorded anomalies during Merriweather's incumbency were auditory in nature, beginning as subtle disruptions that could easily be dismissed as the settling of an ancient building. During his solitary hours in the church, often while preparing for Sunday services or attending to administrative matters in the vestry, Merriweather reported hearing footsteps pacing the length of the nave. These were not the creaking sounds of timber expanding and contracting with temperature changes, but distinct rhythmic impacts that suggested the weight of a person moving with purpose. On several occasions, the rector would cease his work and investigate the main body of the church, expecting to find a parishioner or a wayward traveler who had entered seeking shelter. In every instance, the nave was empty, the heavy oak door remained bolted from the inside, and the dust motes dancing in the light from the stained glass appeared undisturbed. The footsteps would often stop the moment he emerged from the vestry, only to resume once he had returned to his desk, creating an impression of intelligent reaction rather than random environmental noise. As the weeks turned into months, the phenomena escalated from auditory disturbances to physical manipulations of the environment that were witnessed by Merriweather and, eventually, by others. One of the most persistent occurrences involved the heavy iron latch of the west door, a mechanism that required significant force to lift. Witnesses, including the rector, observed the latch rising slowly of its own accord, the metal grating against the hasp, before falling back into place with a loud clang, as if an invisible hand had tested the lock and released it. This would happen in broad daylight as well as in the evening, defying the explanation of wind pressure or drafts, as the door was solid oak and the latch mechanism was internal. The atmosphere within the church began to change, with specific areas becoming associated with sudden, inexplicable drops in temperature that remained localized to a few square feet. Merriweather described these cold spots as intense and penetrating, often accompanied by a distinct sweet floral scent that defied the musty, damp reality of the stone interior. This scent was frequently identified as violets, a detail that aligned with local oral traditions concerning a figure known as the Pink Lady, though Merriweather initially resisted connecting his experiences to village legends. The rector's journals from this period reflect a man struggling to reconcile his theological training and rational worldview with the undeniable sensory evidence presenting itself on a daily basis. He began to document the incidents with the rigor of a scientific observer, noting dates, times, atmospheric conditions, and the presence of any other witnesses. One of the most disturbing categories of phenomena involved the sensation of touch, which marked a transition from passive haunting to active interaction. Merriweather reported instances where he felt a gentle but firm pressure against his shoulder or back while standing at the altar or working in the vestry. On one specific occasion, while kneeling in prayer, he experienced the sensation of a woman's hand resting on his head, a touch he described as comforting yet deeply unsettling due to the empty room. This physical contact escalated over time, leading to an incident where the rector felt himself being embraced by an invisible form. He described the sensation as a soft, yielding weight leaning against him, accompanied by the auditory phenomenon of a purring sound similar to a large cat, which seemed to emanate from the space directly beside him. This specific detail, the purring, remains one of the most idiosyncratic and baffling elements of the Langenho case, distinguishing it from more traditional accounts of poltergeist activity. The interactions were not always benign. There were moments where the atmosphere in the church became heavy and oppressive, creating a physical resistance to movement. In a report that was later corroborated by psychical researchers, Merriweather described an invisible barrier that would manifest across the chancel steps. Attempting to cross from the nave to the altar, he would encounter a palpable wall of force that required genuine physical exertion to push through. This phenomenon was not constant but appeared sporadically, often on days when the ambient sense of tension in the building was at its highest. The activity was not limited to the interior of the church. The surrounding grounds and the path leading to the rectory were also sites of recurring anomalies. The phantom cyclist was a phenomenon reported by multiple locals and the rector himself, involving the visual manifestation of a figure riding a bicycle along the narrow lane approaching the church. Witnesses would see the figure approaching in the distance, but as it drew near or passed behind a hedge, it would vanish completely, leaving no tracks on the muddy road. This apparition was distinct from the entity within the church, suggesting that the location was a convergence point for multiple layers of unexplained activity. The most credible external corroboration of the haunting came during a period of repair work when workmen were brought in to address the deteriorating state of the roof and masonry. These laborers, men accustomed to hard work and not easily frightened, became increasingly reluctant to remain in the building alone. They reported tools being moved from where they had been placed, often appearing in locked rooms or on high ledges that were inaccessible without ladders. One workman reported seeing a figure standing in the pulpit, looking down at the empty pews, only for the figure to dissolve into a mist when approached. The fear among the workers grew to such an extent that some refused to return to the site, causing significant delays in the renovation efforts. Merriweather noted that the entities seemed to resent the intrusion of the workmen, with the frequency and intensity of the poltergeist-like activity increasing whenever repairs were attempted. Stones were reported to fall from the ceiling in trajectories that defied gravity, landing gently rather than with the force of a falling object, or sometimes being thrown horizontally across the nave. The rector's isolation deepened as the Second World War approached, and the local community became focused on the broader anxieties of the conflict. However, the activity at St. Mary's continued unabated, indifferent to the geopolitical turmoil, remaining locked in its own repetitive cycle of manifestation. During the war years, a new phenomenon emerged involving the church organ, an instrument that had seen better days but was still functional. Meriwether and visitors to the rectory would hear the organ playing music at times when the church was known to be locked and empty. The music was described not as the random mashing of keys, but as coherent, melancholic melodies that did not correspond to any known hymns or compositions. On investigation, the music would cease abruptly the moment the door was unlocked, leaving the church in total silence. It was also during this period that the visual manifestations became more distinct, moving beyond shadows and peripheral movement to full apparitions. The most frequently cited figure was that of a woman, often described as wearing attire from a previous century, who would be seen gliding through the wall of the vestry or standing near the font. This figure was often associated with the scent of violets and was perceived by Meriwether as the source of the more benign interactions, such as the gentle touches and the feeling of companionship. However, a darker presence was also noted, a shadowy, masculine figure that seemed to lurk in the corners of the bell tower and was accompanied by feelings of dread and nausea. Meriwether termed this darker aspect the Watcher, a presence that felt distinctly hostile and voyeuristic, in contrast to the sorrowful demeanor of the female apparition. The physical toll on the rector became evident. The constant vigilance required to live and work in such an environment led to a state of chronic nervous exhaustion. He began to invite investigators and colleagues to the church, not for fame, but for validation of his own sanity and to seek an explanation for the impossible events he was living through. One visiting cleric, initially skeptical, fled the church in terror after witnessing the heavy vestry door slam shut and lock itself while he was standing only a few feet away. Another visitor reported seeing a hand materialize in the air and extinguish a candle on the altar, a sight that was recorded in the correspondence between Meriwether and psychical researchers of the era. The ambiguity of the Langenhoe haunting lies in the lack of a clear narrative resolution or a single cause for the phenomena. Unlike hauntings that are attributed to a specific tragedy or crime, the activity at Langenhoe seemed to be a complex layering of residual energy and intelligent interaction that spanned centuries. The identity of the Pink Lady was historically linked by some to the Waldegrave family, who had connections to the area, but no definitive evidence was ever found to confirm a specific individual's spirit was responsible. The phenomena appeared to be tied to the land and the stone of the church itself, acting as a battery that stored and replayed the emotions and presence of those who had passed through it. As the structural condition of St. Mary's worsened, the question of its future became a matter of ecclesiastical bureaucracy as much as paranormal investigation. The shifting clay of the marshes was slowly tearing the building apart, causing cracks in the masonry that the rector could no longer afford to patch. It was whispered among the locals that the land was reclaiming the church, that the spirits were driving the living out so that the building could return to the silence of the marshes. In the late 1950s, the decision was finally made to close the church to public worship, citing the dangerous condition of the fabric of the building. Meriwether's departure marked the end of the most active phase of the haunting, but the stories did not cease with his exit. Even after the church was closed, people passing by on the road reported seeing lights moving inside the boarded-up windows and hearing the sound of singing carried on the wind. The building stood derelict for several years, a hollow shell inhabited only by the birds and the unseen presences that had tormented its last rector. The ultimate fate of St. Mary's was demolition, a process that was carried out in the early 1960s. It is recorded that during the demolition, the workmen experienced the same unease and mechanical failures that had plagued the renovation attempts decades earlier. Machines would stall without cause, and tools would vanish, only to be found buried in the rubble days later. Once the walls were brought down and the rubble cleared, nothing remained of Langenhoe Church but a scar on the earth and the overgrown graveyard that surrounded it. The rectory, too, was eventually demolished, erasing the physical structures that had housed the phenomena. However, the site remains a place of interest for those who study the unexplained, as reports of anomalies in the area persisted long after the buildings were gone. Visitors to the site of the former church describe a profound and unnatural silence that descends upon the area, a silence where the sounds of the surrounding countryside, the birds, the wind, the distant traffic seem to be muted or cut off entirely. There are continued reports of the scent of violets manifesting in the open air where the vestry once stood, appearing suddenly and dissipating just as quickly. The figure of a woman has been sighted walking among the remaining headstones, fading into the mist that frequently rolls in from the Blackwater estuary. The case of Langenhoe Church remains a singular example of a location-centric haunting, where the activity was so intense and varied that it seemed to possess a life of its own, independent of the observers. Merriweather's detailed accounts serve as a testament to the reality of the experience, devoid of the sensationalism that characterizes more famous cases. He did not seek to profit from the haunting. He simply endured it, documenting the erosion of his reality with the patience of a man besieged. The narrative of Langenhoe is not one of demons or vengeance, but of a thinning of the veil between the present and the past, a place where the memories of the dead possessed enough weight to interact with the world of the living. It stands as a reminder that there are places in the British landscape where the past refuses to remain buried, where the stone and the soil hold on to echoes that can be heard by those who listen in the silence. The enduring mystery is not just what haunted St. Two Mary's, but why the phenomena were so concentrated in that specific patch of marshland, and whether the demolition of the stone structure truly dispersed the energy or merely left it without a vessel, waiting in the open air for the next witness to arrive. To this day, the site of Langenhoe Church is avoided by some locals after dark, a lingering respect for the forces that once walked the nave alongside the Reverend Merriweather. The invisible barrier that once blocked the chancel may be gone, but the sense of a boundary between the known and the unknown remains palpable to those who venture to the site. The story serves as a documented intersection of the mundane and the impossible, where a pragmatic clergyman was forced to coexist with the unexplainable for years, leaving behind a record that defies easy categorization. In the end, the church returned to the earth, but the accounts suggest that the entities were never truly evicted, merely exposed to the sky. The wind that blows across the Essex marshes carries with it the damp chill of the estuary, but occasionally, in the vicinity of the old churchyard, it also carries the inexplicable, faint melody of a hymn sung by no living voice. This persistence of memory, etched into the environment itself, ensures that the solitude of St. Mary's is never truly absolute. The location remains a testament to the unexplained, a quiet corner of England where the laws of physics seemed, for a time, to be suspended by the will of the unseen. For the researcher, Langenhoe represents the quintessential atmospheric haunting, subtle, pervasive, and ultimately unresolved, a puzzle with missing pieces that were lost, along with the stones of the church. The legacy of the case is the chilling realization that a haunting does not require a dark history of crime or murder to exist. Sometimes a location is simply wrong, or perhaps simply occupied by something that has nowhere else to go. It leaves us with the unsettling question of what creates such a focal point of high strangeness, and whether such places are anomalies of nature or windows into a reality that we are not meant to understand. The Reverend Merriweather passed away years after leaving Langenhoe, but his name is forever linked to the vanished church, a guardian who stood watch over a mystery he could never solve. His journals remain the only map to a territory that no longer exists physically, but which continues to occupy a space in the landscape of the paranormal. The marshland grasses now wave over the foundations, concealing the scars of the building, but the silence of Langenhoe retains a quality of waiting, as if the story is not yet finished. It is a narrative of endurance, of the friction between the material and the immaterial, played out on a lonely hill overlooking the cold North Sea. And in that silence, the echo of footsteps on a non-existent stone floor continues to resonate for those who know what to listen for. This park ranger quit after finding what was inside the watchtower. In late autumn of 2019, a park ranger left his post mid-shift and never returned to duty. Evan Mercer was 34, a state park ranger assigned to the Blue Ridge region near Roanoke, Virginia for seasonal staffing support. His job that week was routine patrol, trailhead checks, and locking facilities after sunset as visitor numbers dropped. According to dispatch logs, he also had a small task list tied to a fire lookout watchtower. The tower sat on a ridgeline above mixed hardwood, visible from town on clear days. State records show the tower had been closed to the public for repairs since 2011. Archived notes from the district office describe minor vandalism complaints, mostly broken padlocks and spray paint on the stair landing. Some locals claimed teenagers used the tower for late-night drinking, but investigators never confirmed consistent trespass patterns. Records conflict on when the last full inspection happened, with one sheet listing 2017 and another listing 2018. Evans signed out a key ring on the morning of his shift, including a brass tower key and a secondary gate key. County file from 2009 mentions the tower as a communications fallback point during storm outages. At 3:12 p.m., dispatch recorded Evan calling in that he was headed up the service road toward the Ridge access gate. He noted a fresh chain on the gate, which was not mentioned on the prior week maintenance report. The dispatcher, Kendra Lowe, was 29 and working a double shift covering radio traffic and incident entry logs. She asked Evan to confirm the chain tag and whether the lock was state-issued or privately installed. Evan replied that the chain looked new and he would document it once he reached the tower base. A later entry shows Evan arrived at the tower, clearing around 3:48 p.m., then radioed that the base door was closed. The base door was not the main staircase gate. It was a storage door used for supplies and equipment access. He reported a chemical smell near the doorframe, and he mentioned a sticky residue on the latch plate. Kendra asked him to step back and wait for another unit, but he said he would only look through gaps first. Dispatch logs show a short pause, then a clipped statement that he had found something inside. Kendra requested clarification, but the next transmission was fragmented and did not match normal radio cadence. Evan said there were bundles and a tarp, then he stopped and asked if anyone else was on the service road. She checked units on the board, and the closest ranger was 28 minutes away on a water rescue standby. Evan then said he was backing out, and he asked for a supervisor and a sheriff deputy to respond. The dispatcher noted his voice sounded flat, and she marked the incident as suspicious entry pending. State records indicate Supervisor Mark Duvall was 52, and he was attending a meeting in Salem when the call came through. Is less than hash on. 0 hash is greater than. He directed Evan to secure the area and avoid contact with any materials, then wait in his vehicle by the road. Evan acknowledged, and the next dispatch entry logged him as moving to the truck at 4:03 p.m. 3 minutes later, he radioed again and asked for medical guidance, without giving a clear reason. Kendra asked if he was injured, and he answered that he did not think so, but he needed advice anyway. He then requested that dispatch call his wife, and he provided a number that matched his personnel file. Kendra documented the request, but protocol required a supervisor instruction for personal notification unless there was confirmed danger. Evan insisted, repeating the request twice, and he asked Kendra to write down exactly what he said next. The audio archive includes a note that the transmission was partially clipped by interference. Still, the typed log states he said he was not staying on the job and he would turn in his badge tonight. A deputy from Bottot County arrived first, according to county records, at 4:41 p.m. near the Ridge Access turnoff. The deputy, Samuel Price, was 41 and had prior experience with abandoned structure calls and illegal dumping complaints. He met Evan at the Service Road Junction, and both vehicles were noted on a dash camera timestamp. The deputy reported Evan looked pale and he was shaking, but he did not complain of pain. Evan refused water, and he asked the deputy not to walk him back to the tower, which the deputy documented. Supervisor Duvall arrived shortly after, and a second ranger arrived at 5:09 p.m. based on state vehicle GPS records. The group approached the tower base on foot, leaving Evan by the trucks as a precaution, per the deputy's statement. The deputy described the storage door as locked, with no obvious pry marks, but he noted a smear near the latch. They photographed the door, then cut the chain on the outer gate using bolt cutters from the maintenance kit. The first entry inside was made by the deputy, with the supervisor standing behind him, according to their reports. County file notes describe an improvised sleeping area, using tarps, foam pads, and several plastic tubs stacked near the wall. The deputy also described a strong odor of solvent and animal waste, which he said persisted after the door opened. Items were reportedly arranged with unusual care, including labeled jars and bundles tied with cord. Investigators never confirmed whether the labels were meaningful or decorative, and the original photos were later restricted. State records mentioned possible hazardous materials, and an environmental response unit was requested before further handling. Archive notes from the responding supervisor say there were personal effects that did not appear to belong to park staff. They reported 2 backpacks, assorted clothing, and a box of paper documents in a damp plastic tote. Some locals claimed the box included missing person flyers, but investigators never confirmed that detail in public briefings. Records conflict on whether any electronics were found, since one sheet lists a prepaid phone and another lists none. The deputy recorded that no one searched the upper tower levels until additional personnel arrived with safety gear. At 6:22 p.m., dispatch logged Evan leaving the scene alone in his truck before being formally cleared by his supervisor. Duvall attempted to reach him by radio twice, and those calls were marked unanswered in the log. A state record entry later stated Evan texted that he was sick and he would report to headquarters next day. He did not return the next day, and a resignation email arrived 2 days later from his personal account. The email, quoted in archive notes, did not describe the tower, and it only said he could not continue work. His wife, Marissa Mercer, was 32 and worked in medical billing in Roanoke, and she later gave a written statement to state investigators. She said Evan returned home before dark, showered for a long time, and threw his uniform into a trash bag. She said he asked her to lock the bedroom door that night, and he kept a light on until morning. She also said he would not discuss what happened, and he avoided news reports about the park afterward. Marissa reportedly contacted a counselor for him, but he attended only one appointment, according to her statement. The park closed the Ridge Road for 3 days, citing maintenance, and the public notice was brief and nonspecific. State records show environmental staff tested for volatile chemicals, and the results were described as inconclusive in a summary. The summary used careful language, noting potential contamination without listing exact compounds or concentrations. Some locals claimed they saw men in white suits, but investigators never confirmed the number of responders on site. Dispatch logs show at least one call to a hazardous materials coordinator with a reference number later redacted. County records indicate the sheriff office opened a case file labeled unlawful entry and possible dumping, then transferred key materials to state investigators. A county file from 2009 was pulled to compare prior tower condition reports and previous calls for service. That older file mentioned a brief squatters camp discovered near the same ridge, but not inside the tower base. Investigators noted the tower location made it hard to monitor since the service road was gated and poorly visible. Records conflict on whether a new camera system was approved because budget notes list a request but no purchase order. Evans' personnel file shows he had no disciplinary issues and had received positive evaluations for public contacts and trail safety work. He had transferred from a coastal district in 2016, and he took the mountain assignment for family reasons. Several coworkers said he was steady and cautious, according to archived notes from informal interviews. One coworker reportedly said Evan hated enclosed basements and avoided them during inspections, but investigators never confirmed a formal phobia record. Another coworker said Evan carried gloves and a respirator in his truck, which was common for cleanup tasks and not unusual. After his resignation, Evan's name appears in a state record only twice, both entries tied to equipment return attempts. A supervisor noted that Evan mailed his badge and keys back in a padded envelope without a return address. The package included a short note stating he was sorry and he hoped the park would be safe for families again. The note did not mention the tower, and it did not include any allegation, description, or specific claim. County records show no criminal charge against Evan, and he was not listed as a suspect in the unlawful entry case. Public rumor grew anyway, partly because the park never released clear details, and partly because Evan's abrupt departure looked dramatic. Some locals claimed the tower contained evidence linked to missing hikers, including boots, IDs, and scraps of map paper. Investigators never confirmed such a link, and state records show no direct cross-reference to active missing person cases. A retired volunteer, quoted in archived notes, said the ridge had long been used for hiding stolen property after break-ins. That claim was not supported by arrests, and county files list only minor theft complaints in the surrounding area. A state investigator wrote that the most alarming aspect was the door condition, which suggested intentional sealing rather than random trespass. The report described residue on the latch area, and it noted tape fragments near the frame without identifying brand or type. Environmental staff reportedly advised against lingering inside, and they recommended ventilating the space before a detailed search. The logs mention a brief headache complaint by one responder, but medical follow-up was not documented in the summary file. Records conflict on whether any lab samples were retained, since one page lists chain of custody numbers and another lists none. In interviews, the deputy described the interior as organized but unsettling, and he chose that word carefully in his statement. He said the arrangement looked like someone planned to stay, and he noted supplies for weeks, not a single night. He also said there were signs of recent activity, including warmth under a tarp, though he could not verify a heat source. Investigators never confirmed if the warmth was measured, and later reports avoided repeating that detail without proof. The deputy said he did not see blood, weapons, or a person, and he emphasized the absence of clear crime markers. Supervisor Duvall's archived notes emphasize procedures, including securing the scene, restricting access, and documenting every entry and exit time. He noted Evan's initial reaction as unusual because Evan avoided the tower area after opening the door gap. Duvall wrote that Evan refused to repeat what he saw, and he refused to answer direct questions beyond basic safety concerns. Duvall attempted a welfare check later that night by phone, and the call went unanswered, according to logs. A follow-up visit to Evans' house was discussed, but state records show no formal request, possibly due to jurisdiction limits. Marissa's statement adds a small detail that investigators flagged, because it matched evidence language in the dispatch notes. She said Evan complained his hands smelled wrong even after washing, and he scrubbed under his nails repeatedly. She said he asked her if certain fumes could stick in the nose, and he asked about headaches and dizziness symptoms. She reportedly offered to take him to urgent care, but he refused and said he was not poisoned, just shaken. The next day, she said he drove to a pharmacy and bought gloves, wipes, and a heavy-duty trash bin for the garage. State records show the tower base was later cleared and items were removed, though the inventory list is heavily redacted. A short line states that personal property was retained for investigation and the remainder was disposed following guidance. The case status in county files shifted from active to inactive within 2 months, with no public suspect named. Some locals claim the case was quietly reassigned to a broader task force, but investigators never confirmed any reassignment. A later public records request produced only partial pages, and several sections were withheld under exemptions for ongoing inquiries. In early 2020, a local paper requested comment, and a state spokesperson issued a statement about safety and trespass prevention. The statement referenced routine maintenance and emphasized that public areas remained open, with no hazard to visitors. Records conflict with that reassurance because internal notes describe at least one temporary closure of nearby trails during follow-up checks. The paper also attempted to contact Evan, but the contact number in his former file was disconnected by then. Marissa declined comment, according to the reporter, and she requested privacy and asked that rumors stop circulating in the community. Several months later, a new chain and lock appeared on the ridge gate, and the key control logs show stricter sign-out rules. The tower staircase was also blocked with a welded barrier, according to a maintenance note dated mid-2020. Some locals claimed they heard sirens up there again, but investigators never confirmed additional incidents tied to the tower afterward. The last archived note about Evan states he moved out of the area, though the record does not list a destination. Kendra, the dispatcher, later transferred to a different role, and her personnel note cites schedule stress, not the tower incident. What remains in the official file is mostly silence, with careful phrasing and missing attachments where clearer answers might have been. Dispatch logs preserve the moment Evan's voice changed, and state records preserve the fact that he never explained why. County file from 2009 sits beside newer reports, showing the tower had a history of being useful and vulnerable. Some locals claimed the watchtower held proof of something bigger, but investigators never confirmed any link beyond unlawful entry. Evan's resignation stands as the cleanest fact, an abrupt end that began with a door, a smell, and words that stopped short.